We need medical assistance. Is there a doctor on this flight?
Marcus Chen's hands trembled as he stared at the woman dying 3 rows ahead. He had exactly 90 seconds to make a decision that would haunt him forever. Speak up and risk everything: his future, his scholarship, his dying grandmother's last hope for proper care, or stay silent and watch an innocent woman and her unborn child slip away. The cabin lights flickered. A desperate scream pierced the darkness. "Someone help! She's turning blue!" Marcus closed his eyes. The medical textbook in his lap suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. At 17, he knew exactly what was killing her: a pulmonary embolism, deadly and swift. He'd seen the same condition nearly take his grandmother 6 months ago, but who would believe a black teenager from the Bronx? The flight attendants rushed past him without a glance, their eyes scanning for doctors in first class, skipping over his economy seat as if he were invisible. He'd lived with that invisibility his entire life. "Please, God, somebody!" The silver-haired man's voice cracked with terror. "My wife is pregnant. She can't breathe." Marcus felt the weight of every eye and economy avoiding the commotion, passengers pulling blankets over their heads, pretending not to see. Just like his neighborhood had been invisible to the rest of Manhattan for decades. 60 seconds. His grandmother's voice echoed in his mind. "Knowledge unused is knowledge wasted, baby. The Lord don't give gifts to hoard them." But this wasn't just about medicine. This was about a system that had taught him from birth that people who looked like him weren't trusted, weren't listened to, weren't valued, especially by people like the wealthy couple in first class. 30 seconds. The woman's gasping grew weaker. Marcus stood up. His legs felt like concrete, but his voice, when it came, was steady and clear. "I think I know what's wrong with her." What Marcus didn't know, what none of them could have predicted, was that the next 30 minutes would trigger a chain of events that would expose buried prejudices, shatter carefully constructed walls between worlds, and force one of Manhattan's wealthiest men to confront a truth so painful it would bring him to his knees. This is their story. The story of a choice made in darkness above the frozen ocean, and the impossible request that would change everything. Alexander Whitmore stepped from his midnight blue Maybach onto rain-slicked pavement. Italian leather shoes worth more than most people's monthly rent. At 62, he moved with the unhurried confidence of generational wealth, old money that spoke in whispers, not shouts. "Careful, darling," he murmured, guiding his wife Victoria from the vehicle. At 45, Victoria Whitmore still turned heads, a former ballet dancer whose pregnancy gave her an almost supernatural glow. But beneath her composed exterior, worry lines deepened around her crystalline blue eyes. After 5 miscarriages and a decade of failed fertility treatments, this 29-week pregnancy felt like borrowed time. "The Geneva conference is crucial," Victoria said, her hand protective over her belly. "Dr. Morrison cleared me for travel. Stop worrying." Alexander's jaw tightened. His wife had no idea he'd arranged for 3 separate medical teams to be on standby along their route: Geneva, London, and back to New York. Money couldn't buy certainty, but it could buy options. Neither noticed the battered yellow taxi that pulled up 5 cars behind them, nor the lanky teenager who emerged, counting crumpled bills with careful precision. Marcus Chen winced as he handed over his last $73 to the taxi driver. Every penny he'd saved from 2 years of night shifts at the corner bodega and weekend tutoring gigs. The emergency 20 his grandmother had taped inside his wallet stayed hidden. "Just in case, baby. Promise Nana you'll keep it safe." At 17, Marcus carried himself with the wary intelligence of someone who'd had to grow up too fast. His worn backpack contained everything that mattered: acceptance letter to the International Youth Medical Summit in Geneva, dog-eared anatomy textbooks, and a photo of his grandmother and late mother, both smiling despite everything life had thrown at them. "You're going to show those fancy doctors what a Chen can do," Grandmother May had said that morning, her gnarled fingers straightening his collar while the oxygen concentrator hummed its mechanical lullaby. At 78, ravaged by COPD and congestive heart failure, she remained the strongest person Marcus knew. What he hadn't told her, the summit had only covered partial expenses. The remaining costs, airfare, 5 nights in Geneva, meals, had come from his mother's small life insurance policy. The same mother who died of untreated cervical cancer 3 years ago because their insurance wouldn't approve the screening that might have caught it early. This trip was everything. His escape route from the Bronx. His chance to become the doctor his neighborhood desperately needed. His grandmother's hope for care beyond the overcrowded clinic that treated Medicaid patients like burdens. Inside JFK's bustling terminal, Marcus navigated through the crowd with practiced invisibility. He'd learned young how to make himself small, how to avoid triggering the subtle alarm systems that tracked young men who looked like him. Security guards' eyes followed him anyway. Mothers pulled children closer, the usual choreography of suspicion. He was so focused on finding his gate that he nearly collided with a luggage cart. Sidestepping, he caught sight of them, the elegant couple from outside now gliding toward the first-class check-in counter where staff materialized like magic. Marcus watched for just a moment before turning toward the endless economy line, unaware that in a few hours, their worlds would collide in the most devastating way imaginable. "Braxton Hicks again," Victoria murmured, pressing a hand to her side as they settled into the private lounge's leather chairs. "They're getting stronger." Alexander's fingers froze on his phone screen. "Should we call Dr. Morrison? We can delay." "We're not delaying." Victoria's voice held the steel that had taken her from Brooklyn to the New York City Ballet before a career-ending injury at 23. Before she'd married into the Whitmore dynasty and learned to navigate their world of silent judgments and whispered comparisons. "I'm fine. The baby's fine. Stop treating me like I'm made of glass." But Alexander had already pulled up Dr. Morrison's number, thumb hovering over the call button. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, the same instinct that had made him billions by knowing when to pull out of failing investments. What he didn't know, that instinct was about to save his life, while almost costing him his soul. Across the terminal, Marcus studied flashcards in the economy boarding line, whispering medical terms like prayers. Deep vein thrombosis, pulmonary embolism. Symptoms include sudden dyspnea, chest pain, tachycardia. He had no way of knowing those words would soon become horrifyingly, urgently real. The contrast couldn't have been starker. The Whitmores were escorted aboard with deferential reverence, settled into pods that converted to fully flat beds. Champagne for Alexander, sparkling elderflower water for Victoria, warm towels, noise-canceling headphones, the cocoon of privilege. Marcus shuffled down the narrow economy aisle, squeezing past irritated passengers to reach his middle seat between a businessman claiming both armrests and an elderly woman already snoring against the window. His knees pressed into the seat ahead, his backpack barely fit under the seat. As the plane taxied into the darkness, climbing toward the stars, none of them could have predicted how quickly their carefully separated worlds would shatter, or how a life-or-death crisis at 35,000 feet would expose truths that luxury and poverty had conspired to hide. The cabin had settled into that liminal space between departure and arrival, most passengers suspended in fitful sleep. Marcus remained awake, too wired about the summit interview to rest. He'd negotiated his way past his snoring seatmates and stood in the rear galley, reviewing notes by soft emergency lighting. "First time flying?" asked an older flight attendant. Her name tag read Sharon, as she organized a beverage cart. "Yes, ma'am, headed to Geneva for a medical summit." Sharon's eyebrows rose with genuine surprise. "Medical summit? At your age? That's impressive, young man." Before Marcus could respond, a call light blazed red on her panel. "First class. Urgent." "Duty calls," Sharon said. But something in her expression had shifted, a flash of concern quickly masked. Marcus returned to his seat, unaware that in first class, Victoria Whitmore had just pressed her hand to her chest, confusion clouding her eyes as an unfamiliar tightness spread through her lungs. "Alexander," she whispered, not wanting to alarm him. He'd been so anxious, so protective. "I feel strange." Alexander was alert instantly, years of light sleep making him hypersensitive to any change. What kind of strange? Breathless, dizzy. Victoria tried to smile reassuringly, but her lips had taken on a faint blue tinge. Probably nothing. But it wasn't nothing. Within 60 seconds, Victoria's condition spiraled from concerning to critical. Her breathing became labored, sweat breaking across her forehead despite the cabin's cool temperature. The tightness in her chest exploded into searing pain. Alexander! Real fear in her voice now. Something's wrong. The baby. Help! Alexander's composed exterior shattered. My wife needs help! Now! The commotion rippled through the aircraft like an electric shock. In economy, Marcus jolted awake to urgent whispers. Pregnant woman, first class, can't breathe. His blood went cold. He knew those symptoms. He'd seen them 6 months ago when his grandmother collapsed in their apartment, her lips turning blue, her chest heaving as she fought for air. The ambulance ride, the diagnosis that had nearly killed her, pulmonary embolism, blood clot in the lungs. Pregnancy multiplied the risk exponentially. Sharon rushed past his row, medical kit in hand. Is there a doctor on board? She called desperately, scanning economy faces that looked away, avoiding involvement. Marcus felt paralyzed. This was the moment, the choice that would define everything. Speak up and risk humiliation, disbelief, failure, or stay silent and live with the guilt forever. His grandmother's words, "The Lord don't give gifts to hoard them, baby." His mother's death, untreated, undiagnosed, unseen by a system that didn't value her life. Marcus stood up, his voice cutting through the murmurs. I'm not a doctor, but I think I know what's happening to her. Sharon barely glanced his way. We need a medical professional, son. Please sit down. It could be a pulmonary embolism, Marcus said louder, moving into the aisle. Pregnancy increases the risk fivefold. Does she have unilateral leg swelling? Is she gasping between words? This time Sharon stopped, registering both his words and his youth with visible shock. How do you... My grandmother had one. I helped manage her care. She has COPD and heart failure. The words tumbled out as another urgent call came from first class. If it is a PE, she needs oxygen immediately and anticoagulants. Do you have aspirin in your kit? Sharon hesitated for only a second. Protocol versus the confident authority in this teenager's voice. Then, come with me. Now. As Marcus followed her toward first class, he felt every economy passenger's eyes on him. Skepticism, curiosity, the weight of low expectations. What he walked into was controlled chaos. Victoria lay reclined, ashen, her breathing shallow and rapid. Alexander hovered beside her, his face a mask of helpless terror. Sharon was attempting to place an oxygen mask over Victoria's face, but the woman was becoming agitated, fighting the mask, gasping that she couldn't breathe even with it. Alexander looked up as Marcus approached. The man's expression cycled through confusion, desperation, and, Marcus saw it clearly, dismissive calculation. Taking in Marcus's youth, his worn clothes, his race, making instant judgments that decades of privilege had conditioned him to make without thought. Who is this? Alexander demanded. Where's the doctor? There's no doctor on board, sir, Sharon explained quickly. This young man believes he knows what's happening. Alexander's eyes narrowed dangerously. Under any other circumstances, he wouldn't have trusted this boy to deliver his coffee, let alone save his wife's life. But these weren't normal circumstances. His wife was dying, and sometimes desperation cracks open doors that privilege keeps locked. What's wrong with my wife? The question emerged as both command and plea. Marcus swallowed hard, pushing down his awareness of the man's barely concealed skepticism. Sir, I believe she has a pulmonary embolism, a blood clot in her lungs. The symptoms match exactly, and pregnancy dramatically increases the risk, especially during air travel. And you know this how? Alexander's voice dripped with suspicion. Because I've studied medicine since I was 12. I take care of my grandmother. She has similar conditions. I've learned to recognize the signs. Marcus moved closer to Victoria, addressing her directly with gentle authority. Ma'am, do you have pain or swelling in one leg? Maybe it started before the flight? Victoria nodded weakly, gesturing to her left calf. Since yesterday, she managed between labored breaths. Thought normal swelling. Marcus turned to Sharon. We need to elevate her legs immediately, maintain oxygen flow, and if you have aspirin in that kit, she needs one now. It's a blood thinner. Also check for injectable anticoagulants like heparin. Advanced kits sometimes carry them. Sharon exchanged glances with another flight attendant, then nodded decisively. I'll check. Alert the captain. We may need to divert. Alexander watched, stunned, as this teenager gently repositioned his wife with practiced efficiency, explaining each movement with calm confidence that seemed impossible for someone so young. The clot likely formed in her leg, Marcus explained, maintaining eye contact with Victoria to keep her focused and calm. Sometimes they break loose and travel to the lungs. The aspirin will help prevent it from getting bigger while we get you to a hospital. How do you know all this? Alexander asked again, but the accusation had faded, replaced by something closer to wonder. Marcus finally looked up, meeting the older man's gaze directly. Because I had to know. My grandmother depends on me. He turned back to Victoria. The oxygen will help, Mrs. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Victoria, she whispered. Victoria Whitmore. Mrs. Whitmore, try to take slow, deep breaths if you can. We're going to get you through this. In that suspended moment, planes streaking across the dark Atlantic, a teenage boy from the Bronx kneeling beside one of Manhattan's wealthiest couples, something fundamental shifted in the fabric of all their worlds. The carefully constructed barriers of class, race, and assumption had begun to crack. And what would emerge from those cracks would change everything. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're making an emergency landing in Reykjavik, Iceland. Medical teams will be standing by. As the plane banked northward, Catherine's breathing eased slightly with the oxygen and aspirin, but her condition remained critical. The portable fetal monitor showed the baby's heart rate racing, distressed by its mother's crisis. For the next 70 minutes, Marcus stayed at Victoria's side, monitoring vital signs with limited equipment, providing constant updates with professional composure that belied his 17 years. My grandmother always says panic burns oxygen we can't spare, he told Victoria with a gentle smile. So we're going to stay calm together, you and me and your baby. Alexander watched this interaction, struggling with a torrent of emotions he'd spent a lifetime learning to suppress. Relief that someone knew what to do, shame at his initial dismissal, gratitude warring with the uncomfortable realization that he judged this young man based solely on appearance. As the minutes passed and Victoria's condition stabilized under Marcus's care, one emotion finally dominated all others: profound, humbling gratitude. What's your name? Alexander asked finally, his voice rough. Marcus Chen, sir. Thank you, Marcus. The words felt desperately inadequate. I don't know what would have happened if... Don't thank me yet, sir, Marcus interrupted gently. She needs proper medical care as soon as possible. The baby, too. He hesitated, then added quietly, I was supposed to be interviewing at the International Youth Medical Summit in Geneva tomorrow morning. I guess that's not happening now. Something flickered across Alexander's face, recognition, perhaps, of sacrifices being made that extended beyond his own family crisis. But before he could respond, the plane began its descent toward Reykjavik, and all attention returned to preparing Victoria for landing and the emergency team waiting below. As the wheels touched Icelandic soil, none of them could predict how the next 24 hours would unfold, or how a request made in a sterile hospital waiting room would expose buried prejudices, trigger unexpected tears, and force a reckoning that would reshape all their futures. Fluorescent lights erased all distinctions between wealth and poverty. Alexander Whitmore and Marcus Chen sat on identical plastic chairs, separated by 3 seats but joined by shared worry. Victoria had been rushed into emergency care, a team of doctors confirming Marcus's diagnosis within minutes. The lead physician had pulled Alexander aside. The intervention on the plane likely saved both lives. Another 30 minutes and he'd left the rest unsaid. Now, in the sterile limbo of the waiting room, Alexander found himself studying the young man, who sat slouched with exhaustion several chairs away. In the harsh lighting, Marcus looked even younger, barely more than a child, really, despite the adult knowledge that had saved Victoria. "You should get some rest," Alexander said, breaking the heavy silence. "There's nothing more we can do tonight." Marcus looked up, shadows deep under his eyes. "I'd like to know she's okay, if that's all right." The simple statement brought an unexpected tightness to Alexander's throat. This boy had no obligation to them, no connection, no reason to care. Yet here he sat at 3 in the morning in a foreign country, having sacrificed an opportunity he'd traveled halfway around the world to pursue. "Tell me about the summit," Alexander said. "The one in Geneva." Marcus straightened slightly, a spark returning to tired eyes. "International Youth Medical Summit. Only 50 students worldwide get accepted. It was a chance for a full scholarship to medical school for the top 10 participants." Quiet pride beneath the disappointment. "Interviews were supposed to be today." "And you're missing them because of us," Alexander stated flatly. Marcus shrugged, but the loss was evident beneath attempted nonchalance. "Some things matter more. My grandmother would say the same." The mention of Marcus's grandmother triggered memory of the boy's earlier words. "I take care of my grandmother. She depends on me." Such responsibility for someone so young. "You mentioned caring for your grandmother," Alexander prompted. "She has health problems?" "COPD, congestive heart failure, severe arthritis," Marcus recited matter-of-factly. "I've been her primary caregiver since my mom passed 3 years ago. Just the two of us now." Alexander absorbed this, mentally reconstructing his understanding of the young man before him. Not a boy at all, despite his youth. Someone who'd shouldered adult responsibilities far too early. "And the medical knowledge came from caring for her?" "Had to learn fast," Marcus said simply. "Our neighborhood doesn't exactly have great healthcare access. When Mom got sick, cervical cancer, I started reading everything I could find. After she died, I kept going. Grandmother May says I have a gift for it." A faint smile. "She works herself to exhaustion so I can keep studying. Takes in sewing work even with her arthritis so bad she can barely hold the needle. That's why the summit mattered so much. Would have meant a path to medical school without drowning in debt." The matter-of-fact recitation of hardship, delivered without self-pity or accusation, hit Alexander harder than any emotional appeal could have. Here was a young man who had faced more adversity in 17 years than Alexander had in his entire privileged 62 years. Yet he sat in this sterile waiting room, concerned about a stranger rather than his own derailed dreams. "I've been unfair to you," Alexander admitted abruptly, the words surprising even himself. "On the plane I saw—" He stopped, uncomfortable naming his own prejudice. "I know what you saw, sir," Marcus said quietly, without accusation. "I'm used to it." The simple resignation in those 4 words, "I'm used to it," landed like a physical blow. Before Alexander could respond, a doctor appeared. "Mr. Whitmore, your wife is asking for you." "And she's specifically asking for someone named Marcus?" Both stood immediately, following the doctor through labyrinthine corridors. Victoria had been moved to a private room, multiple monitors tracking her vital signs and the baby's reassuringly steady heartbeat. She looked pale against white sheets, but her breathing was clearly easier, the frightening blue tint gone from her lips. Her eyes brightened, seeing them both. "My hero," she said, voice weak but warm. "They told me what you did, Marcus, that you recognized what was happening when no one else could." Marcus ducked his head, suddenly shy. "Anyone with the same knowledge would have done the same, ma'am." "But no one else had that knowledge," Victoria insisted, reaching out a hand. After a moment's hesitation, Marcus stepped forward to take it. "Dr. Stephenson said," Without the quick intervention on the plane, I might have... She stopped, hand moving protectively to her belly. Both of us might have been lost. Alexander moved to her other side, kissing her forehead. How are you feeling, sweetheart? Better. The clot is dissolving with medication. The baby's heart rate has stabilized. She squeezed Marcus's hand before releasing it. Alexander told me you missed your summit interview because of our emergency. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. It's not important right now. It is important, Victoria insisted. It could have meant your future. There will be other opportunities, Marcus said, though the tightening of his jaw suggested he didn't entirely believe it. Alexander watched this exchange, a decision crystallizing. You should rest, he told Victoria. The doctors want you here for observation for at least 48 hours. I've arranged for accommodations nearby. He turned to Marcus. For you too. The airline is providing lodging for all passengers. I've made sure you have a room as well. Thank you, sir. I should call my grandmother. Let her know what happened. She'll be worried. As Marcus stepped out to make his call, Alexander lingered at Victoria's bedside, unfamiliar turmoil churning within him. In a few hours, his carefully ordered worldview had been disrupted by this chance encounter with a young man who defied every unconscious assumption he'd made. He's remarkable, Victoria murmured, reading his expression. So young, but so capable. And to think, if he hadn't been on that flight... Alexander nodded, squeezing her hand. Get some sleep. I'll be right here. As Victoria drifted off, Alexander found himself contemplating privilege, opportunity, and debt. Not financial debt, which he understood intimately, but moral debt, the kind that couldn't be repaid with a simple thank you or even a generous check. Outside in the hallway, Marcus leaned against the wall, phone pressed to his ear, trying to reassure his grandmother. The summit administrators had been sympathetic but clear. Without attending the in-person interview, his application was withdrawn. There would be other years, they said, though the age limit meant this had been his only chance. He didn't share this detail with Grandmother May, focusing instead on the positive, that he'd been able to help someone in need. You did right, baby, May said, her voice crackling with pride and the rasp of her condition. I always told you that knowledge is a gift meant for sharing. I know, Grandma, Marcus replied, swallowing hard. I'll be home soon. As he ended the call, Marcus looked up to find Alexander watching from Victoria's doorway, an unreadable expression on his face. For a moment, the two regarded each other in silence. The millionaire and the teenager, connected by circumstance and separated by nearly everything else. Neither could predict the conversation that would unfold the following day, or the request that would bring unexpected tears to Alexander Whitmore's eyes, forcing him to confront biases he'd never acknowledged and opening a door to redemption he didn't know he needed. Morning in Reykjavik brought watery sunlight that struggled against the November cold. Alexander had spent most of the night in an uncomfortable chair beside Victoria's hospital bed, dozing fitfully between nurse checks and his own anxious monitoring of the machines. Victoria's condition had stabilized significantly. The anticoagulant medication was dissolving the clot, and while she'd need continued treatment throughout her pregnancy, the doctors were cautiously optimistic. You look terrible, Victoria told him over her hospital breakfast. Go shower. Eat something that isn't from a vending machine. I don't want to leave you. I'm fine. We're fine. She patted her belly. But Richard, before you go, find Marcus. I want to do something for him, something meaningful. He saved our lives. Alexander nodded, kissing her forehead before departing. Outside, the crisp air revived him as he waited for a taxi. His phone buzzed with messages from his Geneva office, inquiries about the humanitarian awards ceremony he'd been scheduled to attend, concerns about Victoria, the familiar demands of his world rushing back, yet they seemed strangely distant now, as if the past 24 hours had created a buffer between him and his former priorities. The hotel where the airline had arranged accommodations was modest by Alexander's standards, but clean. As he crossed the lobby, he spotted a familiar figure seated alone in the small cafe, bent over a cup of coffee and a worn notebook. Marcus looked up as Alexander approached, quickly closing what appeared to be a journal. Mr. Whitmore, how is Mrs. Whitmore this morning? Much better, thanks to you, Alexander said, gesturing to the empty chair. May I? Of course. Marcus straightened, his expression guarded yet polite. Alexander ordered coffee before turning his full attention to the young man across from him. In daylight, with the immediate crisis past, he could observe Marcus more carefully. The teenager's clothes were worn but meticulously clean, his posture impeccable despite evident fatigue. There was a dignity in his bearing that reminded Alexander of his own father, a factory worker who'd put himself through night school before eventually founding the small investment firm Alexander had later built into a financial empire. The airline is arranging return flights, Alexander began. They should have details later today. Marcus nodded. I checked already. There's a flight back to New York tomorrow morning. Marcus, I want to talk to you about compensation. The word hung awkwardly between them. Marcus's expression closed further, a weariness entering his eyes that made Alexander realize his mistake immediately. That came out wrong, Alexander amended quickly. I'm not trying to. What I mean is, you're owed something for what you did, for what you lost because of us. I'm not owed anything, Mr. Whitmore, Marcus replied, his tone carefully neutral. I did what anyone should have done. But not what anyone could have done, Alexander countered, and it cost you an opportunity that was clearly important. Marcus was silent for a moment, fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. My grandmother always says, opportunities come and go, but doing right isn't optional. The simple statement stirred something in Alexander, a memory of similar words from his own father, perhaps, or recognition of the kind of principled character his wealth had insulated him from encountering in recent decades. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman, Alexander said softly. I'd like to meet her someday. Surprise flickered across Marcus's face. She'd like that, I think. She's always telling me I need to meet more kinds of people, see more of the world. Is that why you applied to the summit in Geneva? Partly, mostly because medical school is expensive, and we don't have that kind of money. Marcus's candor was refreshing in its directness. The scholarship would have made the difference between becoming a doctor and not. Alexander nodded, a decision solidifying. I want to help you, Marcus, not as payment, but as recognition of who you are, what you're capable of, the kind of doctor you could become. For the first time, Marcus's careful composure showed a crack, a flicker of hope quickly suppressed. That's very generous, Mr. Whitmore. Let me finish. I have connections at several medical schools, financial resources that could ensure you get the education you deserve. Consider it an investment in a future physician. That's what I do. Invest in promising futures. He watched as Marcus absorbed this offer, conflicting emotions playing across the young man's face. Pride warred visibly with practicality, dignity with need. Take some time to think about it, Alexander added. Talk to your grandmother. This isn't charity, Marcus. It's recognition of merit, something you've earned through years of dedication and natural ability. He pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table. My private number's on the back. Whatever you decide, I want to hear from you. Marcus took the card carefully, studying it before slipping it into his pocket. Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. I will think about it. He hesitated, then added, but there's something else I wanted to ask you about. Not for me, for my grandmother. Alexander's eyebrows rose. What about her? She needs better medical care than she's getting. Our insurance barely covers the basics. And the specialists she needs keep referring her around because they don't take Medicaid patients. Marcus's voice remained level, but his hands betrayed his emotion, clasping tightly on the table. If you really want to help, that would mean more to me than any scholarship. The request caught Alexander off guard. He'd expected, what? A request for cash? Connections to the summit he'd missed? Instead, here was this remarkable young man asking not for himself, but for the grandmother who'd raised him. Of course, Alexander said immediately. I can arrange for the best care available. specialists, treatments, whatever she needs. Marcus shook his head slowly. It's not just about money or connections, Mr. Whitmore. It's about how the system works, or doesn't work, for people like my grandmother. She's not the only one in our neighborhood struggling to get basic care. There's a community clinic that tries, but they're understaffed, underfunded, overwhelmed. Alexander listened as Marcus spoke with quiet passion about healthcare disparities in the Bronx. Elderly residents who couldn't navigate complex insurance systems, families choosing between medication and food, children with asthma living in buildings with black mold because landlords knew their tenants couldn't afford to move. The young man's perspective was both intimate, shaped by personal experience, and surprisingly sophisticated in its understanding of systemic issues. As Marcus spoke, Alexander felt something shift inside him. The humanitarian award waiting in Geneva suddenly seemed hollow, recognition of tax-deductible donations rather than meaningful change. Here was a young man who understood the true meaning of service in a way Alexander's wealth had insulated him from ever needing to learn. What would make a real difference? Alexander asked when Marcus finally paused. Not just for your grandmother, but for your community? Marcus's eyes widened, clearly surprised by the scope of the question. Honestly, a properly funded community health center with specialists who actually live in or care about the neighborhood. People who see patients as people, not insurance codes. Transportation assistance for the elderly and disabled. Medication support programs. Health education in schools. He shrugged. But that's big picture stuff, beyond what I was asking for. Maybe it shouldn't be, Alexander said thoughtfully. My foundation is finalizing plans for a medical center in Tanzania. Important work, but I've never considered something similar right in New York. The need exists in both places, Marcus said carefully. Just because America is wealthy doesn't mean all Americans are. The simple truth of this statement hit Alexander with unexpected force. How many times had he flown over the Bronx on his way to his Connecticut estate, never giving a thought to the communities below? How often had he donated to international causes while ignoring disparities in his own city? Disparities that had killed Marcus's mother and were slowly killing his grandmother? Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. A text from Victoria's doctor requesting his return for a consultation. I need to get back to Victoria, he said, standing suddenly, reluctant to end this conversation that had opened unexpected doors in his thinking. But this isn't finished, Marcus. What you've said, it matters. It's given me a lot to think about. He extended his hand, which Marcus rose to shake. Will you come to the hospital later? Victoria would like to see you before we all leave tomorrow. Marcus nodded. I'd like that. Please tell Mrs. Whitmore I'm glad she's doing better. As Alexander left the hotel, his mind raced with new possibilities. The Tanzania project was already funded, already in motion. But perhaps there was room for a parallel initiative closer to home, not as a replacement, but as a complement, a recognition that need existed everywhere, sometimes in places he'd trained himself not to see. By the time he reached Victoria's hospital room, the outlines of a plan were forming, a plan that would transform not just Marcus's life or his grandmother's care, but potentially an entire community. And perhaps, though he was only beginning to recognize it, a plan that might transform Alexander himself in the process. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through Victoria's hospital window as Alexander sat beside her bed, explaining his conversation with Marcus. She listened intently, her eyes brightening with each detail. So his request wasn't for himself at all, she marveled, just better care for his grandmother. Not even a direct request for her alone, Alexander clarified. He spoke about the whole system, community clinics, transportation issues for elderly patients, medication costs. He shook his head, still processing his own reaction. Victoria, listening to him, I realized how narrow our philanthropy has been. Well-intentioned but distant, Victoria supplied. Safe. Alexander nodded, recognizing the truth in her assessment. Their charitable giving had always been carefully managed, strategically aligned with business interests, focused on causes that garnered positive press and networking opportunities with other wealthy donors. Even the Tanzania Medical Center, Their most ambitious project to date had begun as a tax strategy before Victoria's genuine passion had transformed it into something more meaningful. "I want to do something different," Alexander said, taking her hand. "Something closer to home. Something Marcus helped me see." Victoria squeezed his fingers. "Tell me." As Alexander outlined his emerging idea, a comprehensive community health initiative in the Bronx, with Marcus's neighborhood as the pilot location, Victoria's expression grew more animated than he'd seen since before her medical crisis. "This is perfect, Alexander," she said when he'd finished. "Not just for Marcus and his grandmother, but for us too. For the baby." She placed her free hand on her belly. "I want our child to grow up understanding that privilege comes with responsibility. Real responsibility, not just writing checks from a distance." A knock at the door interrupted them. Marcus stood in the doorway, looking somewhat uncomfortable in the hospital setting despite his evident medical knowledge. "Marcus," Victoria's face lit up. "Come in, please. The doctors say I'm doing much better. Thanks to you." Marcus entered carrying a small gift shop bouquet that seemed to embarrass him slightly as he presented it. "Just wanted to bring something. My grandmother always says never visit someone in the hospital empty-handed." "It's lovely," Victoria assured him, accepting the flowers with genuine warmth. "And speaking of your grandmother, Alexander has been telling me about your conversation this morning." Marcus glanced between them, his expression guarded. "I hope I didn't overstep." "Quite the opposite," Alexander interrupted, standing to offer Marcus the chair closest to Victoria. "You've given me a new perspective, one I should have had long ago." As Marcus cautiously took the offered seat, Alexander remained standing, suddenly energized by the plan taking shape in his mind. "Marcus, what would you think about helping us design a new kind of community health initiative, starting with your neighborhood, but potentially expanding to other underserved areas in New York?" Marcus's expression shifted from caution to confusion. "Sir, I don't understand." "The Whitmore Foundation has resources that could make a real difference," Alexander continued. "But what we lack is insight, the kind you have from living in the community, from caring for your grandmother, from seeing the gaps in the system firsthand." "You want my advice?" Marcus said slowly. "More than advice," Victoria interjected, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "We want your partnership, your vision. You know what your community actually needs, not what outsiders think it needs." Alexander watched as Marcus processed this unexpected proposal, the young man's expression cycling through disbelief, caution, and tentative hope. "This would be a paid position, of course," Alexander added, "compatible with your studies, and it would include a full scholarship for your medical education, not as charity, but as investment in someone who will bring crucial perspective to the initiative. And full medical care for your grandmother," Victoria added softly. "Immediately. The best specialists, whatever she needs." Marcus sat very still, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. When he finally spoke, his voice was controlled but thick with emotion. "Why would you do this? You don't even know me." The question hung in the air between them, simple yet profound. Alexander exchanged a glance with Victoria before answering. "Because what you did on that plane wasn't just about medical knowledge," he said carefully. "It was about seeing beyond appearances and assumptions. It was about moral courage, stepping forward when it would have been easier to stay silent." He paused, finding himself on unfamiliar emotional ground. "I've been successful in business partly because I'm good at evaluating people quickly. But on that plane, I evaluated you wrong. I saw a kid who couldn't possibly have anything to offer in a crisis. I was wrong, and that mistake could have cost me everything I truly care about." Victoria reached for Marcus's hand. "What Alexander is trying to say is that meeting you has made us reconsider what matters, what we want our legacy to be. This child," when she touched her belly, "will be born into privilege. We want to make sure that privilege is used to connect, not separate." Marcus looked down at Victoria's hand covering his own, then up at Alexander, his expression open and vulnerable in a way it hadn't been before. My grandmother always said, heaven puts people in your path for a reason. A small smile. She also says, always look gift horses in the mouth and count their teeth. But I think she'd make an exception in this case. The tension in the room broke, all three of them laughing. So that's a yes? Alexander asked, finding himself genuinely anxious for the answer. It's a yes, Marcus confirmed, his smile growing. But I have conditions. This can't be just about my grandmother or me. The initiative has to involve local community leaders from the beginning, and it can't be a short-term project that disappears when the next interesting cause comes along. Agreed, Alexander said without hesitation, impressed yet again by the young man's maturity and perspective. We'll draw up a proper proposal with your input, long-term commitment, community leadership, transparency in all decisions. Victoria beamed between them, then grimaced slightly as she shifted position. The momentary discomfort reminded all of them of the fragility of the connection that had brought them together. How easily things might have gone differently if Marcus hadn't been on that flight, if he hadn't spoken up, if Alexander hadn't finally listened. There's one more thing, Marcus said, hesitation returning to his voice. My grandmother, she'd want to meet you both before I agree to anything final. She's old school that way. We'd be honored, Victoria said immediately, as soon as I'm cleared to travel. Alexander nodded agreement, though he found himself unexpectedly nervous at the prospect of meeting the woman who had raised such a remarkable young man, a woman who might see through the veneer of wealth and status to the flawed human being beneath. It was a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to feel in his carefully controlled world. As the conversation continued, plans taking shape for what would eventually become the Bronx Community Health Initiative, Alexander found himself watching Marcus, the animation in his features as he described his neighborhood, the precise intelligence in his suggestions, the fundamental decency that seemed to guide his every thought. In that hospital room in Reykjavik, with ice crystals forming patterns on the windows and the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor, something profound was shifting. Not just a business arrangement or philanthropic initiative, but a recognition of shared humanity that transcended the barriers Alexander had never even acknowledged building around his life. Later, as they prepared to part ways until their rescheduled flight the following day, Alexander found himself alone with Marcus in the hospital corridor. I have a confession to make, Alexander said quietly. When you first came to help Victoria on the plane, I didn't trust you. I made assumptions based on... He faltered, uncomfortable with naming his own prejudice. Based on what I look like. Marcus finished for him, his tone matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. I know, Mr. Whitmore. I've dealt with those assumptions my whole life. I'm sorry, Alexander said simply. The words inadequate but sincere. Marcus studied him for a moment before responding. My grandmother says ignorance can be fixed with knowledge, but only if you're willing to learn. A small smile. Seems like you're willing. The simple absolution, offered without fanfare, brought an unexpected lump to Alexander's throat. He extended his hand, and when Marcus took it, he pulled the young man into a brief, awkward embrace. Thank you, Alexander said, stepping back and clearing his throat, embarrassed by his own emotion. Not just for Victoria and the baby, but for opening my eyes. Marcus nodded, his own eyes suspiciously bright. See you tomorrow, Mr. Whitmore. As Alexander watched the young man walk away down the sterile hospital corridor, he felt a certainty he rarely experienced outside of business decisions. Their chance encounter on that transatlantic flight wasn't an ending, but a beginning. The first chapter of a story that would continue to unfold long after they returned to New York. A story that would change not just Marcus's community, but Alexander himself in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. Alexander Whitmore's midnight blue Maybach rolled slowly through the streets of the South Bronx, drawing curious glances from residents unaccustomed to seeing such luxury in their neighborhood. In the back seat, Victoria sat beside Alexander, her pregnancy now prominently showing as she entered her third trimester. The medical crisis in Iceland seemed almost dreamlike now, though her daily anticoagulant injections served as a constant reminder of how close they had come to tragedy. Are you nervous? She asked, noticing the unusual tension in her husband's posture. Alexander, who routinely negotiated billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat, fidgeted with his cufflinks like a schoolboy before an exam. A little, he admitted. It feels important to make a good impression. Victoria covered his hand with hers. Just be yourself, the real self, not the Whitmore Financial Group CEO self. The car pulled up in front of a weathered apartment building with a broken elevator sign posted at the entrance. Alexander stared up at the facade, mentally calculating the property's value compared to their Manhattan penthouse. The disparity was staggering, another layer of reality he'd never had to confront directly. Marcus waited for them at the entrance, his face breaking into a genuine smile as they emerged from the car. He looked different here in his home environment, more relaxed, more himself in jeans and a faded Columbia University sweatshirt that had clearly belonged to someone larger. Perhaps his late mother. "Welcome to our neighborhood," he said, extending a hand to help Victoria from the car. "Grandmother May is excited to meet you both. Fair warning, she's made enough food for about 20 people." As they climbed the 5 flights of stairs to the Chen apartment, Alexander insisting on carrying the gift baskets they'd brought despite Marcus's protest, the physical reality of Marcus's daily life became clear. This was a building where the elevator had been broken for months, where residents with disabilities like Mei Chen were effectively trapped in their homes without assistance. "Grandma hasn't been outside in almost 3 weeks," Marcus explained quietly as they paused for Victoria to catch her breath on the 4th-floor landing. "The oxygen tank is too heavy for her to manage on the stairs alone, and I've had school and work." Alexander made a mental note to add building infrastructure to the Community Health Initiative scope. What good was medical care if patients couldn't physically access it? The apartment door opened before they could knock, revealing Mei Chen waiting with dignified expectancy. Oxygen tubes in her nose attached to a portable tank, but dressed as if for an important occasion in a pressed jade green tunic and carefully styled silver hair. "So these are your airplane people," she said to Marcus in lightly accented English, her deep voice warm despite the assessing look she gave the Whitmores. Come in, come in. Don't stand in the hallway letting all the heat out." The apartment was small but immaculately kept, with furniture from an earlier era polished to a shine. Family photos lined the walls. A younger May with a woman who was clearly Marcus's mother. Marcus at various ages, school portraits showing his progression from gap-toothed child to the serious young man he was becoming. The rich aroma of home cooking filled the space, a welcoming mixture of dumplings, bok choy, and something sweet steaming on the stove. "Mrs. Chen, thank you for inviting us into your home," Alexander said formally, finding himself unexpectedly intimidated by this elderly woman's penetrating gaze. "We brought a few things." He gestured awkwardly to the gift baskets. "Set those down and come sit," May instructed, waving toward the sofa. "We'll get to gifts later. First, I want to look at the people my grandson saved." Her direct approach was softened by the pride evident in her glance toward Marcus, who was helping Victoria to the most comfortable chair. As they settled in the small living room, May studied Victoria with particular attention. "You look better than Marcus described from the airplane. Good color in your cheeks now. How's the baby doing?" "Strong," Victoria replied, warming immediately to May's straightforward manner. "The doctors say there's no sign of any lasting effects from what happened. We're incredibly grateful to Marcus, if he hadn't recognized what was happening." "Heaven puts knowledge where it's needed," May said simply. "I've been telling this boy since he was knee-high that his brain was a gift meant for service." She turned her assessing gaze to Alexander. "Now, Mr. Millionaire Man, Marcus tells me you're planning some kind of health program for the neighborhood." Alexander, caught off guard by the direct address, found himself stumbling over the practiced explanation he'd prepared. "Yes, that is, the Whitmore Foundation we want to establish a comprehensive community health initiative, starting with this neighborhood as a pilot. Marcus's insights have been invaluable in helping us understand the real needs." May interrupted, unimpressed by corporate language. "And why here? Plenty of poor neighborhoods in New York. Why suddenly interested in the Bronx? The question cut through pretense, demanding honesty. Alexander glanced at Marcus, who watched the exchange with careful neutrality, then at Victoria, who gave him an encouraging nod. Because Marcus made me see what I'd been choosing not to see. Alexander admitted, abandoning his prepared speech. I've lived in New York my entire life, made my fortune here, but I behaved as if places like this neighborhood didn't exist, except as statistics in charitable giving reports. He looked directly at May. Your grandson didn't just save my wife and child, Mrs. Chen. He made me question things I've never questioned before. May held his gaze for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, surprisingly, she laughed, a deep, rich sound that transformed her stern countenance. Well, honesty at last. I can work with honesty. She turned to Marcus. This one might not be as hopeless as most rich folks. Might actually learn something. The tension in the room dissolved. Marcus's relieved smile matched Victoria's. Alexander felt as if he'd passed some crucial test without fully understanding its parameters. Now, May continued briskly, before we eat, I want to know exactly what you're planning. No corporate double talk. Plain English. What are you going to do? When are you going to do it? And how are you going to make sure it doesn't disappear when you find some other cause that catches your fancy? Over the next hour, as they moved to the small dining table laden with more food than the four of them could possibly consume, Alexander outlined the emerging plan for the Community Health Initiative. May's probing questions stripped away any remaining corporate veneer, and the conversation became increasingly practical and specific. Transportation services for elderly and disabled residents, a renovated community clinic staffed by doctors with cultural competency training, medication assistance programs, preventative care outreach, health education in schools. And you want Marcus involved how, exactly? May asked, serving Victoria a second helping of almond cookies, despite her protests that she couldn't eat another bite. In any way he's willing to be, Alexander answered honestly. His perspective is invaluable. We've offered him a formal paid advisory role that would work around his school schedule, leading to a full medical school scholarship. May nodded slowly. And the catch? There's always a catch. No catch, Mrs. Chen, Victoria interjected gently. What Marcus did for us. There's no price tag we could put on that. This isn't payment. It's recognition of his exceptional abilities and character. Abilities that might never have gotten the support they deserve in a system that... She hesitated, then continued with quiet conviction. In a system that too often overlooks young men who look like your grandson. May studied Victoria for a long moment before turning to Marcus. What do you think, baby? These are airplane people. You trust them? Marcus, who had been relatively quiet during the detailed discussions, considered the question seriously. I do, Grandma. I think they mean what they say. A small smile. And if they don't, I know you'll set them straight. This prompted another rich laugh from May. That's the truth. She turned back to the Whitmores, her expression becoming serious again. My grandson is special, not just smart, though heaven knows that brain of his has been working overtime since he was a baby, but good, the kind of good that's rare in this world. Whatever you're planning, it better be worthy of him. We know, Alexander said simply. That's why we want his input from the ground up. This isn't about rich people swooping in with solutions. It's about supporting what the community actually needs. May nodded, seemingly satisfied. Well then, let's talk about this fancy doctor you're bringing in to look at my lungs next week. Marcus tells me he's some kind of specialist from your world. As the conversation shifted to May's immediate medical needs, Alexander found himself observing the small apartment with new eyes. The carefully preserved furniture, the meticulously organized medical supplies, the worn textbooks stacked neatly on a small desk in the corner. Everything spoke of dignity maintained against difficult odds, of priorities centered on Marcus's future rather than immediate comforts. Later, as Marcus gave them a brief tour of the neighborhood, pointing out the understaffed community clinic with its perpetual waiting room overflow, the pharmacy that rarely stocks specialized medications, the single grocery store with its limited and overpriced produce, Alexander's understanding deepened further. This wasn't abstract philanthropy anymore. It was about real people in a community that had been systematically underserved for generations. Standing on a street corner as Marcus greeted various neighbors by name, explaining the Whitmore's presence with a simple, "They're friends from a project I'm working on." Alexander found himself imagining how different his own childhood might have been if born into this environment instead of his upper-middle-class suburban upbringing. How many young people with Marcus's potential never got the chance to develop it fully? How many grandmothers like May fought daily battles against systems designed to exclude them? As they prepared to leave, May pulled Alexander aside while Marcus helped Victoria down the building's treacherous stairs. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice lowered but direct as ever. "I've been watching you today, seeing how you look at things, how you listen." Alexander waited, unsure where this was heading. "My grandson saved your wife because he knows things most boys his age don't," May continued. "He knows them because life made sure he had to learn them. There's been no room for innocence in his growing up." She fixed Alexander with a penetrating stare. "When he helps you with this project, you make sure you're learning from him. Really learning, not just using his ideas to make yourself feel better about your privilege." The bluntness of her assessment was jarring, but Alexander found himself nodding in genuine agreement. "I will, Mrs. Chen, I promise." "Good." She patted his arm, her stern expression softening slightly. "Now go take care of that wife and baby of yours, and tell Victoria I'll be expecting her back for more dumplings once the little one arrives." As the Maybach pulled away from the curb, Marcus standing with his grandmother on the building steps to wave goodbye, Alexander reached for Victoria's hand. "What are you thinking?" she asked, noting his unusually reflective expression. "I'm thinking about how easily we might never have met them," Alexander said quietly. "If you hadn't had that clot, if Marcus hadn't been on that flight, if I hadn't finally listened to him, our worlds would have continued in parallel, never intersecting." Victoria nodded, understanding the deeper implication. "And how many other Marcuses are out there that we'll never meet? How many mice?" The question hung between them as the car glided through Bronx streets toward the invisible border that separated this world from the wealthy Manhattan they inhabited. "What Marcus asked for," Alexander said after a long silence, "it wasn't just medical care for his grandmother. It was recognition of her dignity, of his potential, of their community's worth." His voice thickened unexpectedly. "All things I would have missed completely if crisis hadn't forced me to see." Victoria squeezed his hand. "Then we make sure the initiative reflects that understanding. Not just funding, but genuine partnership. Not just for Marcus and May, but for everyone they represent." As the Maybach turned onto Fifth Avenue, the contrast between the Bronx weathered buildings and the gleaming luxury of Manhattan's Upper East Side could not have been more stark. Yet for perhaps the first time, Alexander saw not just the contrast, but the connection, the shared humanity that his wealth had allowed him to forget, and that a chance encounter at 35,000 feet had forced him to remember. Autumn leaves turned golden across Central Park as the Bronx Community Health Initiative opened its doors in a renovated building that had once housed a shuttered community center. On the dedication plaque, beneath the official language of foundation support, a simple quotation appeared: "Heaven puts knowledge where it's needed. Mei Chen, inside." Community residents found not just medical care, but dignity. Doctors who looked like them, staff who spoke their languages, systems designed to accommodate rather than exclude them. Sliding scale fees, evening hours for working families, a pharmacy that stocked the medications people actually needed, transportation services for those who couldn't navigate stairs or subway systems, health education workshops in multiple languages. In one corner office decorated with medical textbooks and a framed acceptance letter to Columbia University's pre-med program, Marcus Chen spent his after-school hours coordinating between medical staff and community needs. His natural leadership abilities flourished under mentorship that recognized his unique perspective as an asset rather than an anomaly. And in a private hospital room across town, Victoria Whitmore cradled her newborn daughter, May Victoria Whitmore, named for two strong women who had shaped the child's world before she even entered it. Beside her, Alexander stood with Marcus and the elder May, who had been transported to the hospital in the Whitmores' private car to meet her namesake. "She's got good lungs," May observed as the baby's cry echoed through the room. "Strong already." "Like her godfather," Victoria said, smiling up at Marcus, who looked both honored and overwhelmed by the role they had asked him to accept. As May held the newborn with practiced ease despite her oxygen tubes, cooing softly to the child who bore her name, Alexander stepped back to observe the tableau. This unexpected family, forged through crisis and connection, bridging worlds that should never have been separate in the first place. In that moment, watching Marcus lean close to hear something his grandmother was whispering about the baby, Alexander felt the full weight of the transformation that had begun on that flight. The boy who had saved his wife and child had also offered Alexander something equally precious, a chance at redemption, at becoming the man he had always claimed to be, but never truly been until now. What Marcus had asked for in return for his heroism wasn't anything Alexander had expected. Not money, not connections, not personal advantage, but recognition of a shared humanity that wealth and privilege had blinded him to for too long. It was a request that had indeed brought Alexander to tears. Tears of shame, of gratitude, and ultimately of hope for the more connected world they were now building together, one relationship at a time. The conference room on the 40th floor of the Whitmore building overlooked all of Manhattan, a gleaming kingdom of glass and steel that had once represented everything Alexander valued. Now, as he stood at the window with Marcus beside him, he saw it differently. Beyond the wealth, beyond the power, he saw the invisible borders, the parallel worlds, the people who kept this city running while remaining unseen. "They want to replicate the model in Chicago," Marcus said, reviewing the proposal on his tablet. At 19, he'd grown into his role with the initiative, his voice now carrying weight in rooms where policy was shaped and funding allocated. "And Detroit, and Atlanta? What do you think?" Alexander asked, though he already suspected the answer. Marcus was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "I think we need to be careful. The Bronx Initiative works because it's built on relationships, on trust that took time to earn. You can't franchise authenticity." Alexander smiled. A year and a half ago, he might have been offended by such directness from someone so young. Now it was exactly what he valued most. Marcus's willingness to speak truth to power, to push back when necessary, to remind him of what mattered beyond spreadsheets and press releases. "So what do you recommend?" "Partner with existing community organizations in those cities. Don't impose our model. Help them build their own. Provide funding, technical support, but let local leaders drive the vision." Marcus looked up from his tablet. "And maybe I could help. Visit these communities, share what we've learned, if it doesn't interfere with my studies. Columbia won't mind if one of their pre-med students misses a few classes to speak at healthcare conferences," Alexander said dryly, "especially since your work with the initiative is basically a master class in public health administration." Marcus grinned. "Grandmother May still can't believe I'm getting college credit for bossing doctors around, as she puts it. How is she doing? Really?" The question was personal now, not perfunctory. Over the past year and a half, Alexander had become genuinely invested in May's well-being, not as a debt to be paid, but as someone he'd come to respect and surprisingly care for. "Good days and bad days," Marcus admitted. "The new medication protocol is helping. Having specialists who actually listen to her, who treat her like a person instead of a case number, that's made the biggest difference." He paused. "She asks about you and Victoria constantly, wants to know when you're bringing little May by for dumplings." "This weekend?" Alexander suggested. "Victoria's been craving her cooking anyway. Says hospital food during her stay spoiled her for everything except May's recipes." It was a ritual now. Weekend visits to the Bronx, family dinners in that small apartment, that had somehow become as much a home to the Whitmores as their penthouse. Baby May had taken her first steps on that worn carpet, had learned to clap her hands while Grandmother May sang old Chinese lullabies. The borders between their worlds hadn't disappeared. Alexander understood now that they never fully would. But they'd become permeable, crossable, less about separation and more about the journey between. "There's something else I wanted to talk to you about," Marcus said, setting down his tablet. "Something personal." Alexander turned from the window, giving Marcus his full attention. Over the months, he'd learned to recognize when the young man needed to be heard, not as an advisor or employee, but as, what? A protege? A friend? A son he'd never had? "I've been thinking about my mother a lot lately," Marcus continued, "about how she died, how the system failed her." Alexander waited, sensing there was more. "The initiative has been amazing. It's helping people like I dreamed it would. But it's also showing me how deep the problems go. For every patient we help, there are 10 more who can't access care because they're in a different neighborhood, or they're undocumented, or they're caught in gaps between programs." "You're right," Alexander acknowledged. "What we've built is important, but it's not enough." "I want to specialize in oncology," Marcus said suddenly, "specifically in serving underserved communities. I want to make sure no one else's mother dies like mine did, ignored, dismissed, diagnosed too late because she couldn't afford the screenings that might have caught it early." The passion in Marcus's voice reminded Alexander of that moment on the airplane. A teenager stepping forward despite fear, despite the likelihood of being dismissed, because doing right wasn't optional. "Then that's what you'll do," Alexander said firmly. "And the foundation will support that specialization. We'll expand the initiative to include cancer screening and treatment programs. We'll—" "Alexander," Marcus interrupted gently, using his first name as he'd finally been persuaded to do. "This isn't about asking for more funding. I just wanted you to know, to understand why this matters so much to me." "I know why it matters," Alexander said, his voice unexpectedly rough. "Your mother, your grandmother. Every patient who walks through our clinic doors carrying stories of systemic failure." He paused. "And I'm grateful you've helped me understand, that you've been patient with me while I learned to see what was always there." Marcus studied him for a moment, then smiled. A full, genuine smile that lit up his entire face. "You know what Grandmother May told me last week? She said, that Whitmore man had a heart all along, just took the right person to help him find it." Alexander laughed, though his eyes were suspiciously bright. "Your grandmother is terrifyingly perceptive. Always has been." They stood together at the window, looking out over the city, no longer separated by invisible walls, but connected by a bond forged in crisis and strengthened through genuine commitment to change. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel glittered with Manhattan's elite. Philanthropy's who's who gathered for the annual Healthcare Innovation Awards. Alexander Whitmore sat at the head table, now 67 years old, his hair more silver but his eyes brighter than they'd been in decades. Beside him, Victoria held their daughter May's hand, the 5-year-old squirming in her fancy dress, more interested in the elaborate centerpieces than the speeches droning from the podium. On Victoria's other side sat Grandmother May Chen, now 83, still requiring oxygen but dressed elegantly in traditional Chinese silk, her presence commanding respect from everyone who passed their table. And at the podium stood Dr. Marcus Chen, now 24 years old, in his second year of medical school at Columbia, accepting the Emerging Healthcare Leader Award. 5 years ago, Marcus began, his voice steady and clear. "I was a scared 17-year-old on an airplane, watching a woman die while everyone around me looked for someone more qualified, more credible, more expected to help." The room had gone quiet, captivated by his presence. I almost didn't speak up. I almost let fear and the weight of low expectations silence me. But my grandmother had taught me that knowledge unused is knowledge wasted, and my mother's death had taught me that silence can be deadly. Alexander watched Marcus command the room, this young man who had once been dismissed with a glance now holding the attention of some of the wealthiest, most powerful people in healthcare. What I didn't know then was that speaking up would change not just one life, but hundreds. That the crisis on that airplane would lead to the Bronx Community Health Initiative, which has now served over 15,000 patients. That it would inspire similar programs in 8 other cities. That it would lead to policy changes in how community healthcare is funded and administered. Marcus paused, his eyes finding Alexander in the crowd. But more than that, what I didn't know was that it would forge connections across worlds that seemed unbridgeable, that it would teach me and teach others that the barriers separating us are constructed, not natural, that they can be dismantled one relationship, one moment of courage, one choice to see each other's humanity at a time. He looked down at his notes, then set them aside. The man who initially looked at me with suspicion on that airplane is now someone I call family. His daughter is named for my grandmother. We share weekend dinners and birthday celebrations. We argue about healthcare policy and laugh at each other's jokes. We've built something together that neither of us could have built alone. Alexander felt Victoria's hand find his under the table, squeezing gently. This award has my name on it, but it represents the work of hundreds, the community leaders who trusted us when they had every reason to be skeptical, the patients who shared their stories, the medical professionals who believed in a different model of care, and especially the family who opened their hearts when crisis forced us together, the Whitmores who chose to learn, to change, to become partners in building something meaningful. Marcus's voice grew stronger, more passionate. But here's what I want you all to understand. This story shouldn't be exceptional. It shouldn't take a medical emergency at 35,000 feet to make people see across differences of race, class, and background. It shouldn't require crisis to build the kind of healthcare system where everyone, regardless of zip code or income, can access quality care. The room was absolutely silent now. Every day there are young people in communities like the Bronx, like the South Side of Chicago, like East Detroit, who have knowledge and talent and potential that could change the world. But they're invisible to systems designed to overlook them. They're dismissed before they can speak. They're lost to a society that values wealth over worth, credentials over capability, appearance over actual ability. So while I'm honored to accept this award, I'm also issuing a challenge. Don't wait for an airplane crisis. Don't wait until someone you love needs help to recognize the humanity and potential in people you've been conditioned to overlook. Build the bridges now. Create the systems now. Invest in communities now, not out of guilt or obligation, but because it's right. Because talent is universal, even if opportunity is not. Because the next person who could save your life, or change your perspective, or help you become who you're meant to be, might be someone you'd normally walk right past. Marcus looked directly at Alexander, his expression full of warmth and gratitude. Thank you to everyone who believed in this work. Thank you to my grandmother, who taught me everything that matters. Thank you to my mother, whose loss drives me every day to build a more just healthcare system. And thank you to the Whitmore family, who proved that it's never too late to see differently, to choose compassion, to become the best version of yourself. As Marcus stepped away from the podium to thunderous applause, Alexander found tears streaming down his face, not tears of shame as they had been that day in the Reykjavik hospital, but tears of pride and gratitude and overwhelming love for this young man who had saved so much more than his wife's life. Little May tugged on his sleeve. "Why are you crying, Grandpa Alex?" The title, one she'd assigned herself, that Marcus had supported, that Alexander had embraced with surprising emotion, represented everything that had changed. "Happy tears, sweetheart," he managed. "Very happy tears." Grandmother May leaned over, patting his arm with her weathered hand. "Good tears," she said in her accented English. "Tears of man who learned to see, who learned to love, who learned that family is made, not just born." As Marcus made his way back to their table, stopping to accept congratulations from dozens of people, Alexander thought about the question that had haunted him 5 years ago in Iceland. Why would you do this? You don't even know me. Now he understood. They'd done it, all of it, the initiative, the partnership, the transformation of their lives, not because they'd known each other, but because they'd chosen to know each other, to see each other, to recognize that the arbitrary circumstances of birth shouldn't determine the boundaries of family, of community, of care. Marcus reached their table, and little May launched herself at him, wrapping small arms around his legs. "You were so good up there, Uncle Marcus." Everyone was clapping. "Thanks, little M," Marcus said, scooping her up. "You think Grandmother May will let me have an extra dumpling for my victory dinner tonight?" "Always more dumplings," Grandmother May declared. "Victory or no victory, you're too skinny, working too hard." "See?" Marcus said to Alexander, grinning. "This is the real award right here. Guaranteed dumplings for life." And as their makeshift family laughed together in that glittering ballroom, bridging worlds that should never have been separate, building a future that honored both crisis and choice, Alexander understood something fundamental. The question wasn't why Marcus had asked for what he did. The question was why it had taken Alexander so long to see what had always been true, that every person carries dignity and worth, that family extends beyond blood, that the greatest privilege isn't wealth or status, but the opportunity to see clearly, to love broadly, and to build connections that heal rather than divide. What Marcus had asked for, recognition of his grandmother's dignity, investment in his community's worth, partnership in creating real change, wasn't extraordinary. It was basic humanity. And the fact that it had seemed extraordinary, that it had brought Alexander to tears, that it had required a crisis to make visible what should have been obvious all along. That was the real tragedy the initiative was working to change. One patient at a time, one relationship at a time, one choice at a time. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the newly constructed May Chen Memorial Teaching Hospital in the Bronx, a state-of-the-art facility funded by the Whitmore Foundation and designed in consultation with community leaders. Unlike the gleaming impersonal hospitals of Manhattan, this building was warm, welcoming, with art from local students on the walls and multilingual signage guiding patients through spaces designed for dignity rather than efficiency alone. Dr. Marcus Chen, now Chief of Oncology and Associate Director of Community Health, walked the corridors with confident ease, greeting staff by name, checking on patients with the same gentle authority he'd shown at 17 on that airplane. He paused at the main entrance where a massive photograph hung, captured 20 years earlier by a newspaper photographer on that day in Reykjavik. A 17-year-old Marcus, looking impossibly young and serious, kneeling beside Victoria Whitmore's airplane seat, his hand checking her pulse while Alexander watched with an expression of dawning wonder. Below the photo, a plaque, "Where crisis reveals character and courage creates connection." In memory of Alexander Whitmore, 1963-2039, who learned to see. Alexander had passed away 6 months earlier, peacefully in his sleep at age 76. His will had included a final gift to the initiative, an endowment that would ensure its survival for generations, along with a personal letter to Marcus that had reduced the now-grown doctor to tears. "You saved my wife's life on that airplane," Alexander had written in his elegant script. "But you saved my soul in the years that followed. You taught me that the distance between privilege and purpose is measured not in money but in willingness to see, to listen, to change. Thank you for your patience with me. Thank you for showing me what it means to truly live. I love you, son. Always have, from the moment you had the courage to speak up when everyone else had learned to stay silent." Now Marcus stood at that memorial photo, remembering. Grandmother May had passed years before, at 90, surrounded by family, her biological grandson and her adopted family, the Whitmores, all of whom had gathered to say goodbye to the woman who had shaped them all. "Uncle Marcus." He turned to see May Whitmore, now 25, a first-year resident in pediatrics, hurrying down the corridor in scrubs, her mother's elegant features combined with the determined energy that had defined both her father and her namesake. "We've got a situation in pediatrics," she said breathlessly. 8-year-old presenting with symptoms that aren't quite matching the initial diagnosis. "I could use your eyes on this." Marcus smiled, falling into step beside her. Victoria's daughter had inherited more than just a name. She'd inherited a commitment to service, a refusal to accept easy answers, and a deep understanding of how privilege carried responsibility. "Tell me the symptoms," he said as they walked. As May rattled off the case details, Marcus felt the familiar clarity that had first emerged on that airplane 2 decades earlier. The ability to see patterns, to trust his instincts, to speak up even when others might dismiss him. Some things never changed, but so much had. The Bronx Community Health Initiative now served hundreds of thousands across multiple cities. Medical schools had adopted its model of community partnership in their curricula. Policy had shifted, slowly but meaningfully, toward recognizing that healthcare was a right, not a privilege. And in small, everyday ways, people were learning to see each other, to recognize that the teenager on the airplane might save your life, that the grandmother in the worn apartment might be the wisest person you'll ever meet. That family could be built across any divide if you were willing to take the first step. Marcus and May reached the pediatrics ward, where a worried family waited. Recent immigrants whose English was limited, whose insurance was basic, but who would receive the same quality of care as the wealthiest patients in Manhattan. Because that's what the initiative had built. That's what Alexander's transformation had made possible. As Marcus examined the young patient, asking questions through an interpreter, explaining his thinking to young Dr. Whitmore the way Alexander had once asked him to explain his reasoning on that airplane, he felt the full circle of it all. Crisis had revealed character. Courage had created connection, and that connection had rippled outward in ways none of them could have predicted that night over the Atlantic. The 8-year-old would be fine. Marcus identified the issue within minutes, adjusted treatment, and stayed with the family until their worry eased into relief and gratitude. As he left the ward, he passed the hospital's wall of stories, hundreds of photos and testimonials from patients whose lives had been changed by the initiative. Photos of elderly residents receiving home care, children getting asthma treatment, cancer survivors who'd been caught early, families who'd found support during their hardest moments. And in the center, a photo from last month's 20-year anniversary celebration. Victoria Whitmore, now 70, standing between Marcus and May, her arms around both. 3 generations of connection visible in a single frame. The caption, "Family where love transcends every boundary." Marcus pulled out his phone, texting Victoria as he did every morning. "Good morning. Miss him today. Hospital is beautiful. You should see how May's developing as a doctor. Alexander would be so proud." The response came within seconds. "He is proud," watching from wherever stubborn old philanthropists go when they finally learn to see clearly. "Dumplings tonight? Our place. Can't have you getting too thin." Marcus smiled, pocketing his phone. Some traditions never changed. As he headed to his next patient, Dr. Marcus Chen, the boy from the Bronx who'd almost stayed silent on an airplane, who'd been dismissed with a glance but spoke up anyway, understood something profound. The question that had started everything wasn't, "Why would you do this?" It was, "How could we not? How could you see someone suffering and stay silent? How could you recognize injustice and do nothing? How could you experience connection across difference and not work to make it the rule rather than the exception?" The answer Alexander had discovered over 20 years of transformation was simple. You couldn't. Not if you wanted to live fully. Not if you wanted to be whole. Not if you wanted the kind of legacy that mattered. Not wealth or status, but lives changed, connections forged, systems transformed. That was the real gift Marcus had given Alexander on that airplane. Not medical knowledge, not saved lives, though those mattered immensely, but the gift of sight, of recognition, of shared humanity that transcended every constructed barrier. And that gift kept rippling outward, patient by patient, relationship by relationship, generation by generation, building a world where crisis wasn't required for connection, where courage to see each other was the default, not the exception. Where a boy from the Bronx and a millionaire from Manhattan could become family, where an impossible request could transform everything, where love in the end was the only currency that truly mattered. Thank you for joining us on this journey of transformation and connection. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Where are you watching from? Has a chance encounter ever changed your perspective? Have you witnessed the power of courage to bridge seemingly impossible divides? Your engagement helps us continue bringing these powerful true stories to audiences worldwide. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that it's never too late to see differently, to choose compassion, to become the best version of yourself. Until next time, may you have the courage to speak up when others stay silent, and the wisdom to listen when others speak. May you build bridges instead of walls, and may you recognize that family, real family, is made through love, not just born through blood. Subscribe now for more transformative stories that remind us of our shared humanity.